Indeed. Nice to be back. Gotta give that lady a name. Okay. So here's the martini slides I was talking about. So we're starting off with the endocrine system, right? So last time in AMP1, we left off with the nervous system, right? And now we're starting off with the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is important, right? So first of all, let's just kind of scope this out here. So we have our nervous system, which is basically an electrical integration system, right? That's kind of what it does, right? It integrates all of your processes electrically by sending a nervous impulse, right? That's what we learned about in AMP1. But now we have our endocrine system, which is a chemical integration system. Now, the important thing to understand here is what you've just done now is you've essentially created redundancy, haven't you? You don't just have one integration system, you have a second one now. So there's a couple of things you need to understand about the cell and physiology by extension, is that basically nothing you do is cheap. Everything comes at a cost. Make sure that didn't get muted. Okay, good. Right, everything costs. So if you're creating two integration systems, you're not doing this because you're a rich person with discretionary time and money. On the physiological level, on the biological level, there is no such thing as discretionary time or money. Everything in place has a function, and if you don't function, then you're gone. You're a waste of money, right? So it's brutal. It's very utilitarian. So what does that mean? That means then when you have redundancy like this, it's not telling you like, oh, well, look at this. We have this one. We don't need this one. That's not what it's telling you. What it's telling you is that this idea of integration and control and regulation is titanically important. It's so important that you basically create two different systems in order to control and integrate and regulate all of your activities. Okay. So that's what this basically means when we're taking a look at this. So it's kind of speaks a little bit about the importance of all of this. And in a lot of ways, you did talk a little bit about some control and regulation in AMP1, but we talk about a lot of that control and regulation in AMP2, right? Because when you have all this stuff going on, all this complexity of activities going on at a chemical level, you have to have somebody in charge of coordinating it all. And that's what these systems do. They're the coordination systems. Okay. And you got a lot of coordination because you got a lot of things happening in your body that's all going on at the same time. So when you take a look at your endocrine system, what are some of the things that it has to control and regulate? Well, some of those things that it has to control and regulate are some of those long-term types of things, like for instance, growth, right? So you're always growing. Well, not always. I mean, when you're 18, you kind of stop growing, but still technically you're still growing, right? Because you still have things like replacement. Right? Your cells wear out, they've got a shelf life, you have to replace them. You're constantly replacing your skin. So your body parts are constantly regenerating and they're basically moving forward. So that's all part of that growth capacity. You're not necessarily getting bigger, but you're maintaining your current body size. So the endocrine system will basically govern and navigate all of that development, right? So this is basically growth from 0 to 9 months. Wait a minute. Meaning birth, right? Not like from birth to 9-month-old. We're talking about gestation, from a zygote to a baby that's born. That's what you're talking about here, development. You're talking about creating new structure and new capacity, right? So new things, that's what development is. And then of course, the Holy Grail. Reproduction. Why is reproduction important? What's the purpose of every living organism on this planet? You got one task, one goal. One. What is it? To reproduce. That's it. You want to know what the meaning of life is? It's simple. Reproduce. So all those philosophy classes we take, useless. I can tell you in one word what the meaning of life is. Reproduce. There it is. Done. Of course, that's a biological. We obviously have a lot more worth and meaning than that. Right? But that's the point. That's the purpose. When you're talking about physiology and the things in our body that are working, the whole purpose of all of it is pointing in one direction. All of it points toward reproduction. Why do you have the body you have? Reproduction. Why does your body do the things it does? Reproduction. Everything points toward that ultimate goal, reproduction. So how does it do this then? There's obviously a lot more to the story, right? These are easy words, growth, development, reproduction, but how does this actually work? So what the endocrine does is it basically utilizes chemical messengers, hormones, for instance, in order to communicate between cells to coordinate activities, as opposed to the nervous system, which use electrical impulses, right? And not only that, but with electrical impulses, it's a little tricky, isn't it? Because with an electrical impulse, you're limited to the axon. You can only send the electrical impulse down the axon of the nerve that you're sending it down, and you have to synapse with a target. But that signal is bound and sort of restricted or limited by the axon itself. The chemical messengers can go anywhere. They're not limited in space, so they can have greater distribution throughout the body than, say, for instance, a nerve. So this broader distribution allows you to cast a broader, bigger regulatory net. So where the nerves are specifically talking to individual targets or a group of targets, the endocrine system can talk to an entire population by sending out these chemical messages. It's like junk mail, right? So you can talk to a lot of people because you're stuffing those mailboxes pretty much. So let's do a quick rundown of the endocrine system. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because a lot of these we're going to basically break down more specifically later on, or they're going to be broken down more in more detail in chapters of their systems, right? So when you take a look at the players of the endocrine system, at the top of the endocrine system is the hypothalamus, which is a region of the brain just underneath the thalamus. It's got like something like 14 different nuclei in it. If you remember from A&P1, right, a nucleus is a region in the central nervous system in the brain typically, which is a collection of cell bodies. They're usually like processing centers, right? And different nuclei will have different tasks of different sorts of things that they process. There's 14 of those in the hypothalamus. We're usually only focused on a couple of them, okay, that are associated with the endocrine system. But the hypothalamus will produce a couple of hormones that are really important. We're going to talk about these a little bit later on in the semester, but ADH is a big one, oxytocin, and a couple of others that it'll actually produce. We'll talk more about the hypothalamus and what they produce a little bit later on in this particular chapter. Now, next to the hypothalamus and actually attached to it is the pituitary gland. This is basically what we refer to as the master gland. And the pituitary will basically make and release a series of hormones. So from the anterior lobe, it's going to make all of these hormones. So you can see it's going to be making ACTH, TSH, GH, PRL, FSH, LH, and MSH. Whatever those mean, we'll learn about those here in just a second. On the posterior side, it doesn't make, but it releases the oxytocin and the ADH that the hypothalamus made. Okay, so it's releasing all of these hormones, 9 in all. 10 if you actually count MSH. But that's the pituitary gland. So it's kind of like the master gland that's sending out all these master hormones to everywhere else. Now, these next series of glands, these are the two biggies, right? So this is kind of like the queen. Well, it used to be the queen. Now it's the king, King Charles now, right? It's kind of the king and the prime minister, right? So the king would be the hypothalamus, because that's the ultimate head of state in England. And then the prime minister would be the pituitary gland. The reason why I like to use that is because they have a perfect structure, right? Because if you take a look at English government, most of the day-to-day operations in England are governed by the prime minister, right? The prime minister is the one that our president usually talks to. That's the one who's doing most of the work. Now, the king or the royal is kind of like the ultimate head of state, and they have some input, but it's really the prime minister that's doing all of the heavy lifting. And that's kind of exactly the way the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work, okay? So now, what are some of the glands downstream? Well, we have a couple of them. We have the pineal gland, which is a specific gland specializing in the production of melatonin, which is kind of like your own sedative. So basically, it's how you go to sleep. Parathyroid glands, which are to be found where? On the thyroid. These guys will be responsible for making PTH. You guys probably remember that from AMP1, right? That's calcium homeostasis. So we learned about that one. As we start to move down, we've got the thyroid gland, which is then making thyroid hormones, T4, T3, and also calcitonin. So we'll take a look more in detail about how the thyroid gland makes those particular hormones as well. On top of the kidneys, you're going to see the adrenal gland, which is going to be making your adrenalins, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it's also going to be making a lot of sort of housekeeping hormones, sort of metabolic regulators, right? Things like the corticosteroids and cortisol, androgens, aldosterone, things like that, that are kind of things that people don't really think about because we're really like adrenaline junkies. Nobody's really an aldosterone junkie, right? I mean, so we jump off of cliffs because we want that adrenaline rush. So that's kind of like the one that everybody thinks about, but there's the hormones of the cortex are actually probably more important. We're also going to break down the adrenal glands in this chapter a little bit later as well. The pancreas, which is actually kind of a dual organ, and this is the rest of these organs they're dual. What that means is they have a primary assignment in another organ system, but as part of their activities in that organ system is an endocrine activity. The pancreas is a good example. The pancreas is actually part of the digestive system, but it also has endocrine function. It's actually got endocrine and exocrine function. So its endocrine function is associated with its production of insulin and glucagon. That's glucose homeostasis, how it controls blood glucose levels. That's the endocrine activity of the pancreas. Now, it also has an exocrine activity, and that puts it in the digestive functions. So we'll see the pancreas not just in the endocrine system, but we see it again in the digestive system as well. Okay. Now, all the rest of these guys are secondarily endocrine. So for instance, the heart, obviously cardiovascular system, also secretes hormones like AMP and BNP. The thymus, which is actually part of the immune system, also creates hormones called thymosins. Adipose tissue, right? Those are fat cells, secretes things like leptin, but their connective tissue is their primary assignment, right? The digestive system, primarily obviously digestive system, but they produce a ton of hormones actually in the regulation of your digestive process. We'll talk a lot about that when we get to the digestive system. Kidneys, primarily urinary system, they're secreting hormones, EPO, erythropoietin, and calcitriol. And then of course, your gonads, testes and ovaries, right? That's the reproductive system, but they're also producing hormones, testosterone and estrogen. So there's a lot of hormone production, and it's not just dedicated glands that are producing the hormones. There's also other organs that also can produce hormones as well. So producing a hormone isn't the sole property of just a single gland, right? So that's what that story is. So you pretty much, if you need a hormone, guess what? Go make it and release it, right? So we know that these hormones are communicative. That is to say that they're designed to facilitate communication between cells so that you can get coordination. So the question is, what does that communication look like? So we want to take a look at the different patterns of this intercellular communication. How do you do this? Well, there's what's called direct communication. So with direct communication, generally speaking, you have two different cells that are connected together with gap junctions. So how many of you guys remember what a gap junction was? This is general biology, by the way. Okay, that's fine. A gap junction is a type of cell connection where there's like little channels that connect the cytoplasm of cell number 1 with the cytoplasm of cell number 2. So what that means is if there's a change in cell number 1, then that will immediately move through these gap junctions and communicate to cell number 2. So it's like they hear the same instructions at the same time because their cytoplasms are connected to each other. Okay, that's direct communication. So basically, when one hears it, we all hear it. Like right now. Right now is a form of direct communication. I am directly communicating to everybody in the room. Why? Because you are all interconnected with the same airspace. So when I give you an instruction, you can all act on it in unison, right? So that allows you to have that unified, that kind of unified response. You may have remembered this from AMP1. This is what the cardiac muscle cells are connected with, gap junctions, for that unified contraction that they see. We'll see this again later on. There's also what's called paracrine communication. This is basically where a chemical signal is going from cell to cell. So this is kind of like where you have one cell that creates a chemical and it basically responds and is received by another cell. So the communication is going from cell number 1 to cell number 2. Para means beside. So this is like side by side communication. This is typically a fairly common form, but when you're just kind of going side by side, this is good for local communication within the so-called neighborhood. Right? It's kind of like just going door to door or across the street to your local neighbors, and you're just communicating with them in a very local fashion. That's going to work if you're kind of very local, but it's not going to work if this signal needs to go to far regions, right? So if I have a particular message that I need to deliver across the country, this door-to-door thing is not going to work, is it? I need to have a slightly different strategy. And that's basically where we get the endocrine system. So this is basically for long distance communication. Generally speaking, what will happen is the chemicals that are released are dumped into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream, they're distributed throughout the body. Just like if you were to drop a message in the mail, it gets distributed across the country or wherever it is that you're sending it, right? So that's like the endocrine approach. You're dumping it in the bloodstream for distribution. Paracrine is just when you're a local group of neighbors talking to each other like a block party, right? That's paracrine. And then of course, direct is when you're connected to each other and you're literally tethered to each other, okay? So this is actually, so we use all of these in order to get our message all the way across the body. So that kind of gets us to our synaptic communication. We will pick this one up next time, because we're already at our witching hour. We get a little bit of a break, and then we will reconvene in about 15 minutes or so for lab.